Hey guys, so a whole ton of new Senate polls have been released in just the last couple of days, and these really are going to be some of the last polls that we see for many of these races, as the election is only 20 days away now, so we're really not going to get too much more polling for many of these elections. But over the last 2 days, we've gotten polls for many of the major races, especially in Georgia, where early voting has begun, and the early voting numbers right now are looking very, very good for the Democratic Party, and I will go over that in just a couple of moments. We also have new polls from Ohio, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, the race is definitely getting closer, while Democrats continue to expand their lead in Arizona with Mark Kelly, and Tim Ryan is still posing a very strong threat to J.D. Vance in the Buckeye State. And then we also have a new poll showing Ted Budd relatively ahead in North Carolina. So today, we'll be taking a look at these new polls and what they mean for the midterms in just 20 days now. And so starting off with Georgia, we have two new polls that have Warnock up by 3 in one of them, while the other poll shows an even race. But overall, Warnock is in a very good position to win his re-election against Herschel Walker. If the GOP had chosen just a very generic Republican nominee, they probably would be winning. Georgia is a state that does favor the Republicans still more than the Democrats. Yes, Joe Biden won it in the 2020 presidential election, but just go back to 2016, Trump wins Georgia by 5 points. 2012, Romney by 8. Even in 2008, John McCain wins Georgia by a likely margin, and then of course in 2004, George Bush carries it by a solid margin. Georgia is not a blue state, it's purple, but it still does favor Republicans, and in a year like 2022, the GOP really should be winning this race, but they're not, just because Herschel Walker is probably the worst possible person they could have chosen to nominate. And so when looking at the numbers so far for this election, Warnock is up by 4 points, and polling in Georgia has been known to be very, very accurate. It was very accurate in 2020, 2018 as well, and so these numbers really are worrying for the GOP, as Warnock still leads by a pretty impressive margin, even though we're just 20 days away from the election. In fact, voting has already begun in the state of Georgia, and turnout is breaking records. The first day early voting record has been broken in the Peach State. The numbers are nearly double what they were from the last midterms in 2018, and even more than they were in 2020. More people turned out the first day to vote early in Georgia this year than in 2020, which was a presidential election year. And this is good news for Democrats, because when more people vote, Democrats win. There simply is a larger pool of Democratic voters, but Republicans come out to vote more consistently. That's why in every single election since 1992, Democrats have won the popular vote, with the exception of the election in 2004. That's just how strong of a position they have been in nationwide over the last 3 decades. And when you look at the 2020 presidential election, Joe Biden won because turnout was significantly higher than it was in 2016. Clinton and Biden really are not that different of candidates, and of course Trump was the same person, and he had a much larger advantage in 2020 as the incumbent, yet he still lost to Joe Biden because turnout was simply much, much higher. If you look at the 2008 and 2012 elections, Barack Obama did much better in 2008, and turnout was significantly higher then as well. Donald Trump did much better in 2016 because turnout was lower in that year than it was in 2020 most recently. So when looking at the turnout for this year, these numbers are good for Democrats, and of course more Democrats early vote than Republicans by a pretty significant margin, and this shows that there is still enthusiasm to come out for Raphael Warnock, and the governor race is going to go to the GOP, despite the Senate race currently leaning in favor of Democrats. There is a huge discrepancy between the numbers for Raphael Warnock and Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams is down by 6 points in the polls to Brian Kemp. She lost by 1.4% back in 2018, but this year she is doing much, much worse. And if you look at the most recent Trafalgar Group poll, Kemp leads by 9%. This margin is, I think, much larger than the actual margin is going to be, but this same poll shows Raphael Warnock leading by 2% against Herschel Walker, an 11-point difference between a poll conducted by the most Republican pollster in the country. I mean, Brian Kemp should be very happy to even win by 7 points considering how small his margin was 4 years ago, but the fact he's up by 9 and the Senate race is still going blue, according to the Trafalgar Group, is a pretty big indicator as to how well Democrats are going to do in this race. And so that's why I've recently moved Georgia into the lean Democratic column. I do think Raphael Warnock can win outright, and I do think even in a runoff, he will defeat Herschel Walker. That's why, according to 538, he now has a 59% chance at winning. His odds are higher than they have ever been. When looking at this forecast when it was first released, he only had a 38% chance at victory. So Ralphie Warnock really has come a long way in the last couple of months, and as the election nears, trends are still favoring the Democratic incumbent. That's why Georgia is now more solid blue than has ever been throughout the entirety of this election cycle. Next up, in New York, of course, this race is going to be solid blue. Chuck Schumer is definitely on track to winning re-election. The Senate Majority Leader is not going to lose. That has not happened since, I believe, 2002, and it really ever happens throughout the entirety of American history. So Chuck Schumer right now up by 18 points in the polls. He's going to do much better than Kathy Hochul, who's running for re-election as governor after taking office just last year, and she's only up by 9.6% against Lee Zeldin, a single-digit lead for the Democratic governor of one of the bluest states in the country. This honestly is abysmal for the party. Lee Zeldin is doing very well in this race, even though he's probably going to lose. Just look at this Quinnipiac poll. It had Chuck Schumer up by 12, but Kathy Hochul is only ahead by 4. So on the Senate level, though, the race is going to be solid blue. I think Chuck Schumer is going to win by over 15%. While on the gubernatorial level, I think it's very likely that Hochul wins, in fact, by less than double digits. And now moving on to my favorite race to cover, that of course is the election in Ohio, where Tim Ryan is still defeating J.D. Vance in most of the polls. In fact, he's recently retaken the lead. It's now an even race, but really J.D. Vance is slightly behind, as Vance's numbers are slightly below that of Tim Ryan's here. And of course, the box here is also in blue. So even though, according to rounding, the race is even, Tim Ryan does have a very incremental lead here in the polling average. And when looking at this race as a whole, J.D. Vance is the worst choice for the GOP, just like Herschel Walker was in Georgia. If J.D. Vance was not the nominee, this race would not have to be an election for Republicans to worry about. If anyone else won the nomination, like Josh Mandel, they would win by over 5 points, even against Tim Ryan, who is a good candidate. Like I've said before, if this race was held in a 2018 type environment, Tim Ryan would defeat J.D. Vance. There's really no doubt about that. Tim Ryan is a very strong candidate, and that's why I have Ohio as a lean Republican state. I think it will be less solid for the GOP than even Wisconsin, which is much closer to the center politically, especially with the fact that Joe Biden won it in 2020, despite Ohio being a state that Trump still won by 8%, even in 2020 against Biden, just like he did in 2016 against Clinton. And so Wisconsin, I do now have as a likely Republican state, but just barely. I think Ron Johnson will win by just over 5 points, so will still be likely, but not nearly as solid red as states like Iowa or Florida. But Ohio, I do think will be closer than all of these races, even though it honestly should be more solid for the GOP than both Wisconsin and Florida. But at this point, with J.D. Vance as the nominee, they're lucky to even be ahead. Most reliable polls do still have Vance leading, but there have been quite a few recent polls from A-rated pollsters that show Tim Ryan as the preferred candidate. The big one is this Siena College poll that had Ryan up by 3. I think this race will be very, very interesting to watch. I think the margin can get below 3%, but right now we're just going to have to wait for early voting to begin in the state. The debates are finally over. There will be no more debates between Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance, and honestly, the debates are not going to have too much of an impact on this race. But Tim Ryan, I think that it'll be interesting to watch how close he can get to winning, even though he's probably going to lose. And so 538, though, currently gives J.D. Vance only a 72% chance at winning, I believe, Tim Ryan at 28. And when looking at the overall trend, the chances right now for Ryan are higher than they have ever been. When this race first begun, he only had a 10% chance at victory. Now he has almost a 1 in 3 chance at flipping one of the reddest seats in the country. Rob Portman, of course, won his re-election by 21 points in 2016. In Arizona, Republicans are facing the same problem that they have in Ohio and Georgia, and that is the fact that they did not choose a good nominee. Blake Masters is a horrible candidate to run against Mark Kelly. If anyone else had won the Republican nomination in this state, Democrats might be losing this election, or at least it would be more of a pure toss-up. But Blake Masters, who polled worse than both Jim Layman and Mark Bronovich with the support of Donald Trump, eventually won the Republican nomination with just a third of the vote, and that was enough for him to appear on the ballot. And since then, Blake Masters has been behind in every single poll that has ever been released for this Arizona Senate election against the Democratic incumbent. Mark Kelly is a popular senator, definitely much more popular than Kyrsten Sinema, as well as Governor Doug Ducey, and I think that there's a very high chance that he does win re-election by a similar margin to the 2.3% margin that he had in 2020. The national environment simply isn't that great, so even winning by the same margin would be a pretty big win for Democrats. And when looking at the overall map, I don't just pick on Republican candidates. There simply aren't as many poor Democratic choices, especially on the Senate level. I mean, there really aren't too many Democrats that are just outright terrible, too far to the left. Democrats have done a very good job at choosing some very moderate nominees this year. I think they definitely did better than they did in 2020 or 2018, as they realized that they're not going to win with far left candidates. That's why Jessica Cisneros lost against Henry Cuellar in that Texas primary. And when looking at the governor map, though, we do see a different story. I think Democrats have very weak nominees in Oregon, New Mexico, as well as Connecticut. And then Lamont in Connecticut is not popular, nor is Dan McKee in Rhode Island. And then in New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham is just a terrible governor, and Tina Kotek is a terrible successor to Gabe Brown, who is already very, very unpopular. So if Democrats choose bad nominees, I will point it out, but it's just the fact that on the Senate level, their nominees aren't as bad as many of the candidates that Republicans have chosen. And if Republicans have good nominees, I mentioned that as well. I think they made good choices in Colorado, as well as honestly in Wisconsin, because Ron Johnson was the best person to run against Mandela Barnes. If this seat was left open, Democrats would have a much better chance. The fact that they ran an incumbent is a big advantage, and that's why Wisconsin is currently a likely Republican state. If Ron Johnson were not running, I think it would be more leaning to tilt Republican instead of the position that it's at right now. And so when looking at the Arizona race, though, Mark Kelly is currently going to win because Blake Masters is the nominee, not because Mark Kelly is that great of a candidate. I think he's okay, he's a good senator, but if he ran against a strong Republican nominee, he probably would lose considering the national environment that we have right now. And so looking at the 530 forecast, he is heavily favored with a 79% chance at winning. He has always been the favored candidate, but his odds right now are higher than they have basically ever been. They have dipped down just a little bit, but really not too significant of a difference. Mark Kelly's on track to winning, and that's why Arizona is a lean Democratic state. I think he'll win by 1 to 3%, so similar to his previous margin. Definitely nothing too crazy, but I don't think it's going to be under 1 point either. And next up, in Pennsylvania, we really are seeing a tightening election between John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz. This race is getting closer as both candidates seek to succeed incumbent Senator Pat Toomey, who will not be running for re-election after 2 terms. So Mehmet Oz's numbers have been going slightly over the last couple of days. Mainly, it's more of John Fetterman's going down, as his lead has shrunk now to just 5.2%. At its peak, it was 10.7%, and at the beginning of this month, it was still 6 points. And in the middle of last month, it was still 7, 8, 9 percentage points against Mehmet Oz. So John Fetterman's numbers have gone down overall in the last couple of weeks. However, he still does maintain a relatively strong advantage on average, and is still led in every single poll ever released for this election, just like Mark Kelly in Arizona. I, of course, still believe that John Fetterman is going to win, but I do think there's a very good chance that he actually wins by less than 1%. I think that this race is going to get closer and closer. John Fetterman was never going to win by 5 points, 10 points, 8 points. He's not even going to win by the margin he has now. John Fetterman is going to win by, at the most, I think 3%, just like Mark Kelly, but I think there's a good chance he actually does win by less than 1%. But right now, I do still expect him to win this election against Mehmet Oz. He has been the favorite for just such a long time. And Pennsylvania is a state that overall favors Democrats. It voted for Biden by 1.2% in 2020. Trump barely won it in 2016. And of course, Bob Casey and Tom Wolf were both easily reelected in 2018 by solid margins for the governor election. And then for the Senate race, Bob Casey won by 13 points. So Democrats have a track record of doing well in the Keystone State, and I think they will continue to do so in 2022. A flip here would still be a pretty big deal. I mean, it's a flip in a year like 2022 for Democrats. That should be a win in and of itself. And so right now I have Pennsylvania as a tilt state for the Democratic Party. Yes, this is the worst rating I've ever given John Fetterman in the last couple of months, but I do think the race is getting closer, and I think a tilt rating is more appropriate. According to 538, he still does have a pretty high chance at winning. His odds currently sit at 71 out of 100. Mehmet Oz at 29, but his odds were actually 769 now. It was just changed as of the recording of this video, but his odds peaked at 83, and they have gone down ever since, but still, they're much better better than where he was at a couple of months ago. When this forecast was first released, he only had a 1 in 3 chance at winning. Now he has more than a 2 in 3 chance at doing so. So the election is still going to favor Democrats, but I do think the race has gotten closer. And in the end, Pennsylvania may actually be the tipping point state. I think Democrats have a very good chance now in both Georgia and Arizona, and so it might be the flip in Pennsylvania that gives them their 50th seat, and I think that would make this very, very interesting, because for a very long time, I had it as either Nevada or Georgia, but things really are starting to shift. The revelations about Herschel Walker are really hurting him in Peach State. That's why Democrats are doing so much better, while Pennsylvania has been getting closer over the last month as a whole, and so that's why the election there may matter more than actually the ones in both Georgia and Nevada. In the state of Oklahoma, we have 2 Senate races here, the only state with a special election this year. Kendra Horn versus Markwayne Mullin in the special election, with James Lankford also running for re-election against Madison Horn in the regular election, and James Lankford is going to do better than Markwayne Mullin. I think both candidates are going to win by a solid margin, but James Lankford is going to do slightly better than his Republican counterpart, and so when looking at both of these races, of course, Democrats are not going to win, but we do have a much more competitive governor race here, which I think will actually help both Democratic candidates, as Kevin Stitt may even lose his re-election. He's now only ahead by 1 point in the polls. Joy Hoffmeister is very close to overtaking Stitt. Just look at the 3 most recent polls: Hoffmeister plus 1, 7, and 4. And yes, these are not the best polls, but when comparing the governor results to the Senate results, you'll see a very stark difference. If you look at this most recent poll from Amber Integrated, James Lankford leads by a solid margin, but on the gubernatorial level, Joy Hoffmeister is up by 1, and according to Ascend Action, despite both Republican candidates being ahead by double digits on the Senate level, in the gubernatorial election, Joy Hoffmeister leads by 7. Joy Hoffmeister is a former Republican and a very moderate Democratic candidate, and I think that's one of the main reasons why she's doing so well. But in the end, I do still expect Stitt to win at this point in time, but I think the Oklahoma governor race will definitely be very interesting to watch. Just like New York, the establishment party isn't doing as well as they should be, nor are Democrats really doing that well in Oregon either. So as of right now, the Senate races are going to be solid, and that's really what we're focusing on today. But these governor elections may be ones to watch, especially in states like Oklahoma and Oregon, as the conventional party wisdom may not apply. And so we've already gone over the races in Ohio and New York, so now moving on to North Carolina. Ted Budd leads by 6% in the most recent poll against Sheree Beasley. Ted Budd is now doing better than he's been doing since all the way back in late July. He was really never up by a 2-point margin ever since then. Sheree Beasley even took the lead for a couple of weeks early last month. She was out by 1.1% at one point in time, but Sheree Beasley was never really going to win this race. Ted Budd is still the favorite, and he will come out on top in the very end. Polls have been known to underestimate Republicans pretty significantly here in the Tar Heel state, but this 6-point lead is definitely significant. It's a large margin we've seen for Budd over the last couple of months, and when looking at the overall trend, I think Budd can win now by over 5%. I think that his polling numbers are strong enough to the point where he will outperform his polling by enough to win by maybe even 6 points in the very end against Sheree Beasley. Democrats have not won a Senate election here since 2008 with the election of Kay Hagan. They've lost every Senate election since then. Even in 2020, Cal Cunningham lost to Tom Tillis, and in the presidential election that year, Joe Biden actually flipped Georgia, but lost in North Carolina by over a percentage point. And this was surprising because North Carolina was thought to be a bluer state than Georgia. It was closer in 2016. Clinton only lost North Carolina by 4 points, Georgia by 5, and the last time the Democrats won North Carolina in a presidential election before 2020 was 2008, which was pretty recent. Obama carried it in his election, but the last time Democrats carried Georgia before Biden did in 2020 was Bill Clinton back in 1992, and before this you'd have to go back to 1976 in the election of Jimmy Carter, and then 1980 as well when Jimmy Carter lost his re-election, but he still won his home state, which was Georgia. But this year North Carolina is going to stay in the Republican column, and at this point I'm going to move it up to giving it a likely rating. I do think that Ted Budd, just like Ron Johnson, can barely win by 5%. It's going to be a likely state, but it's not going to be nearly as solid for the dubious states like Florida and Iowa, but I think the margin will be just over 5%, which does make it technically a likely Republican state, and right now the 538 forecast give Bud a 72% chance at winning. Republicans are definitely trending well in both Wisconsin and North Carolina, but really not so much in Ohio. Now we have just 2 races left. Neither of them are going to be too competitive, although Utah, I think, is going to be very interesting. But in Illinois, Tammy Duckworth plus 20 points against Kathy Salvi. She's going to win her re-election to a second term. There's no doubt about that. That's why Illinois is a solid blue state. But in Utah, we do have a slightly closer election. Yes, Mike Lee is up by 15 points here, but this is the best poll we've seen from him in a very long time. And this poll was also conducted just at the very beginning of this month. We've seen a more recent poll showing McMullen ahead by 6. This was funded by a super PAC supporting his campaign, but we've seen most of the polls here showing Lee only up by single digits. He really is not doing well in this election at all. Only his own polls show him up by double digits and solid margins. Polls funded by the National Republican Senatorial Committee or polls funded again by his very own campaign. So Mike Lee is not a popular incumbent, and Donald Trump and the MAGA movement are not popular in the Beehive state. That's why McMullen, an independent, is doing so well, because he is on the conservative side of the spectrum. But at this point, it does look like Lee is still on track to winning re-election, and so that's why Utah is going to be a likely Republican state, but much more likely than states like Wisconsin or North Carolina. I think that Lee will win by double digits, but just not by over 15. And then this really isn't a prediction video, but I guess I'll just fill in Nevada so that the map looks a bit more full. I think that Adam Laxalt has a slight advantage over Catherine Cortez Masto currently. But this is the 2022 Senate map based on my new updated ratings after we've seen a lot of these more recent polls. And of course, these ratings are just based on the polls, but I did just want to share them with you as the election does near. Pennsylvania is going to be a much bigger deal now as John Fetterman's lead is shrinking, while Georgia and Arizona, I think, are much more solid for Democrats as time has gone on. And then Wisconsin and North Carolina, I don't think are going to really prove to be that competitive either. Right now, the 4 races I have to watch are Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia, and Nevada. I think these 4 elections are going to be the closest ones, and these ones are going to matter the most. Yes, Ohio is in that list. It's a very good chance that Tim Ryan can win. A surprise is not at all impossible. Surprises almost always happen in every election cycle, and I think that Tim Ryan defeating J.D. Vance could possibly be one of those for this year. And so that will be it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. We've seen a lot of new polls, and I will continue to keep you guys updated, so make sure you subscribe to my channel to get all of my latest notifications. Like this video down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think will win the Senate majority, and I will see you guys in the next one.